You are listening to Verb a Minute, where words do remain.
Three years ago, on October 2nd, 2018, Jamal Khashoggi entered the consulate of Saudi Arabia in Istanbul to obtain documents needed for his approaching marriage. That was the last time anyone from outside had seen him alive. Although now officially solved, the case of the assassination of the Saudi Arabian journalist remains controversial to this day. Hello, and welcome to another episode of the podcast series Right the Wrongs. Every Wednesday and Friday, Right the Wrongs raises public awareness on pressing human rights issues and creates an incubator of activism. Today, we will be addressing the assassination of Jamal Khashoggi. Jamal Khashoggi was born in Medina in 1958 into a family of famous personalities. He was a grandson of the personal physician of the founder of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and a nephew of a high-profile arms dealer. It is no surprise, then, that Jamal proceeded to make a name for himself, although in quite a different way to his relatives. For some time, Khashoggi led a rather usual life. Like many of his friends, he joined the Muslim Brotherhood, sympathetic to Islamist movements. He was colleagues, or even friends, with Osama bin Laden and used to carry out the function of a media spokesperson of the Saudi government. He even allegedly used to carry out secret missions with the goal of collecting intelligence for his home country. How is it possible that Jamal Khashoggi went from a comfortable position close to the Saudi royalty to being assassinated at the orders of its prince? The answer to that question can be given as a series of ruptures that illustrate how Khashoggi progressively strayed farther and farther away from his previous position. The first of these events, which doesn't come as a surprise, were the attacks of 9/11, during which 9 of the 15 terrorists were Saudi nationals. Reportedly, being confronted with pictures of the tragedy was the first time Khashoggi, who remained somewhat conflicted in his feelings towards the other man for the rest of his life, saw bin Laden in a new light. In 2003, while he worked as the editor-in-chief of a Saudi newspaper, Khashoggi allowed a journalist working under him to criticize a 13th century Islamic scholar important in Wahhabism. This led to his dismissal and the beginning of his reputation in the West as a liberal progressive. His views continued to evolve until the culmination point, the Arab Spring of 2011. The protests against the Egyptian president Mohammed Mubarak cemented his position as a fervent apostle of democracy in the region. It was also probably the first time Khashoggi was met with an overwhelming wave of hate on social media. After that, the relationship between Khashoggi and the Saudi government turned into a full-blown war. His criticisms were relentless and widespread. The journalists condemned the blockade against Qatar, the nemesis of Saudi Arabia, which, as it was later found out, influenced some of the articles written by Khashoggi. He wrote pieces against Saudi Arabia's diplomatic disputes with Canada and with Lebanon. Critical of the kingdom's war with Yemen, he wrote, I quote, "Rash actions of the Saudi government are deepening tensions and undermining the security of the Gulf states and the region as a whole." Khashoggi, worthy of his occupation, was also a proponent of free speech and free media. He frequently expressed his hopes for the development of press independent from the national governments across the Arab world. In 2015, he launched the news channel Al Arab, which he based in Bahrain, as in Saudi Arabia operation of independent news agencies is prohibited. One of the main tools of his activism was social media. As described in The Spectator, a British political magazine, I quote, "With almost 2 million Twitter followers, he was the most famous political pundit in the Arab world and a regular guest on the major TV news networks in Britain and the United States." That, and the fact that Twitter was the place of communication between pro-democracy fighters in the region, is why a big part of Saudi attacks on the dissident took place on the internet. It is said that Saudi Arabia used a troll farm in Riyadh with hundreds of accounts to harass Khashoggi online. Most importantly, however, according to former U.S. intelligence contractor Edward Snowden, and later according to confirmations by the American intelligence, Khashoggi's phone was infected with a sophisticated spyware system known as Pegasus. Possibly the most damning content from the point of view of the Saudi officials that could be found on Khashoggi's phone came from his conversations with Omar Abdulaziz, another of the most vocal critics of Saudi Arabia abroad. The two worked together on a number of projects, like the so-called Army of the Bees, a network of pro-democracy activists, a short film on how the Saudi regime was dividing the country, a website tracking human rights, and the political organization Democracy for the Arab World Now. Both dissidents tried at the time to keep their work secret, but with the phones of both Khashoggi and Abdulaziz infected with a surveillance tool, they were in a lost position. In an interview, Abdulaziz said, "Jamal was very polite in public, but in private, he spoke more freely. He was very, very critical of the Crown Prince." In 2017, Prince Mohammed bin Salman, frequently referred to as MBS, reportedly told one of his aides that he would go after Khashoggi, quote, with a bullet. We now know that it was not an exaggeration. If anything, considering the consecutive steps of the assassination, the prince's words promised a fate less horrifying than what has happened in the last minutes of Khashoggi's life. Although not all of the details around the case are known to the public, the majority of the democratic world agrees on most points. On October 2, 2018, two private planes owned by a company controlled by MBS, flying to Istanbul, made a quick stopover in Cairo, Egypt. The jets took off soon after, one of its passengers now carrying a lethal dose of illegal narcotics. It is theorized that at first, the mission was supposed to only consist of kidnapping Jamal Khashoggi and bring him to his home country. The person credited with turning this operation into a murder is a Saudi intelligence officer, Maher Abdulaziz Mutrib, once a work colleague of Khashoggi. However, according to U.S. intelligence, Mutrib wouldn't have made such a decision on his own accord. According to Richard Clarke, a White House counterterrorism advisor under Bill Clinton and George W. Bush, quote, "The decision to kill Khashoggi has to go all the way to the top. Because Khashoggi's a protected person, he's a person who used to hang out with the royalty at the very top." It is one of the arguments used to prove the involvement of Prince Salman in the assassination. What exactly took place after Khashoggi entered the consulate in Istanbul is unclear. However, Reuters, citing a Turkish intelligence source, reported that Saud al-Qahtani, the then top aide of MBS, had made a Skype call to one of the persons inside the building. After an exchange of insults, Qahtani said, I quote, "Bring me the head of the dog," instructing the assassins to kill their prisoner. It is said that Khashoggi was injected with the narcotics picked up in Cairo and then suffocated. His body was then dismembered with a bone saw and taken out of the consulate in several plastic bags. Daily Sabah, a Turkish pro-government newspaper, reported that people living in houses neighboring the consulate had observed an unusual barbecue party. The smoke and smell would have masked the incineration of a corpse. When Khashoggi failed to reappear after his visit to the consulate, his fiancée informed the police of his disappearance. The Saudi government changed its statement several times. At first, it denied the death, claiming that the journalist had left the building alive. Around 2 weeks later, the officials changed their version of events, saying that Khashoggi was strangled during a fistfight. The next week, that story was again contradicted when Saudi Arabia's Attorney General said the murder was premeditated. The immediate reactions of the Turkish government were mixed as well. On October 7th, officials promised to release evidence of the murder. However, just 3 days later, Yasin Aktay, an advisor to President Erdogan, claimed that, quote, "The Saudi state is not blamed here, possibly as an attempt to reserve Turkey's trade ties." Then, the authorities claimed that the footage from cameras inside the consulate of that day was removed and its staff, without a warning, was ordered to stay home. The first accusation from the Turkish side came on October 31st when its chief of police stated that Khashoggi was strangled, dismembered, and that his body was disposed of. However, Turkey wasn't the only country hesitating in its indictment of Saudi Arabia. 6 weeks after the murder, the CIA leaked its conclusion that MBS stood behind it. However, the findings were rejected by the then President Donald Trump. In a statement, he said, "It could very well be that the Crown Prince had knowledge of this tragic event. Maybe he did, and maybe he didn't. In any case, our relationship is with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia." The statement was followed by denial that the CIA had even reached a conclusion. His position was motivated by the great investments made by Saudi Arabia in the US military equipment and training, and also in trade. While Mr. Trump remained skeptical of the version released by the American intelligence, the Senate unanimously passed a resolution that held the Saudi prince personally responsible for the death. It also voted in favor of ending the US military aid for the intervention of Yemen as a punishment to Saudi Arabia. When it comes to Prince Mohammed bin Salman himself, he stated that he bears the responsibility of the Khashoggi assassination to the extent that it happened under my watch, I quote, but he denied any prior knowledge to the event. After around a year of investigation, a trial began at the end of 2019. The court proceedings were closed to the public, only attended by a few foreign diplomats, sworn to secrecy, and members of the Khashoggi family who could not speak at the trial. 11 people were put on trial, while another 10 were released due to lack of evidence against them. On December 23, 2019, 5 named people were sentenced to death for carrying out the killing, and 3 other unnamed ones were sentenced to a combined total of 24 years in prison. In the end, however, the 5 death sentences were reduced to 20 years, and nothing has been heard about the convicts since then. According to some reliable sources, the responsible for the assassination are currently residing in a luxury compound close to the capital of Saudi Arabia. Moreover, Khashoggi's children pardoned the 5 officials. Various international agencies, such as Amnesty International or Human Rights Watch, have dubbed the trial as a sham, closing the proceedings to independent observers, absence of any public records, the fact that no senior officials, much less the Crown Prince, were charged or even questioned are what causes them to dismiss the trial as a whitewash. Even though the US announced sanctions on some individuals involved in the killing, they cannot be considered a serious political move, which, according to some exiled Saudi citizens, has put them in danger. Right now, the Biden administration is facing criticism for accommodating Prince bin Salman for a series of meetings as the two countries work on their cooperation. With the continuous partnership between the United States and Saudi Arabia, and the highly publicized takeover of Newcastle United by the country, that begs the question: do we live in a world where a cruel assassination of a democracy fighter is left without any repercussions? That's all for today's episode on the assassination of Jamal Khashoggi. This episode was written by Kaya and Isis, voiced by Melissa, produced by Maureen with our sound producer Isabella, and brought to you by Right the Wrongs under Verba Manent. The next episode of Right the Wrongs will air on Friday. You can find the program wherever you find your podcasts, bringing you detailed updates on pressing human rights issues. Till next time, take care!